If you are suffering from diabetes, then you definitely need to know about glycemic index and glycemic load of the carbohydrates that you have in food, because they are related to the amount of insulin you may require and the impact on your glucose sugars. Let's have a look about these two concepts in carbohydrates. When you're ready to have your meal, you have a variety of foods available. How would they impact your sugars? Let's have a look. When you're ready to have your meal, the carbohydrates are broken down by the enzymes in your intestines. These carbohydrates lead to rise in glucose levels. The levels can rise pretty quickly. Normally, the levels of glucose after any carbohydrate meal do not go above a certain limit. That's mainly because your pancreas is releasing insulin. The insulin is a strong molecule that keeps your sugars under control no matter what type of carbohydrates you eat. If for some reason you don't have insulin or it remains ineffective, the carbohydrates will push the sugars beyond the limits, and this is what we call diabetes. And that's why the people with diabetes either need insulin or they need tablets to control their sugars. How do carbohydrates impact the sugars? The carbohydrates are broken down by the enzymes in your intestines into simple glucose molecules. This glucose enters the bloodstream and provides a source of energy to your brain. People with diabetes are unable to utilize this glucose as a source of energy. That's why they feel tired and fatigued, but their blood sugars are very high. Every meal would have some form of carbohydrates, whether it is bread or rice, or you have got some other fancy meals like kebabs or sweets. The impact of these carbohydrates on the sugars depends on their glycemic index. What does glycemic index mean? Glycemic index in common term is called GI of the carbohydrates. This is a special number calculated for the carbohydrates. For example, a number below 55 is considered as low glycemic index. This will have a minimal impact on your sugars. A medium glycemic index carbohydrate is the one which has a glycemic index of 55 to 69. This can have a moderate impact on your sugars. The high glycemic index carb is the one that brings the sugars up quite quickly. This is the one with a GI above 70. If you look at the graphs on the right side, you can see the impact of these different glycemic index meals to the sugar. For diabetes, the best carbs would be the ones with low glycemic index. Our common foods are usually containing moderate glycemic index. The high glycemic index carbs are only used for people with diabetes when they have hypoglycemia or they need energy for exercise. Fruits also have carbohydrates. Majority of fruits have low to medium glycemic index because they have plenty of fiber and fluid in them. There are certain fruits which can have high glycemic index, for example watermelon and pineapple. Would they actually push your sugars high? We'll have a look in a few examples. Similarly, our common foods also have variety of glycemic index. You would be surprised to see that common food like chapati is actually got low glycemic index. Similarly, white rice and white bread and potato are high glycemic index, while pizza has got medium glycemic index. And their impact can be as you see on the graphs on the right side. This is because glycemic index of a carbohydrate can be changed by the way you cook it, by the quantity of starch in it, the amount of fat in it, the amount of fiber in it, and how you store the food as well. Specifically for fruits, the ripeness of the fruit changes the glycemic index. For example, a banana, which is not very ripe, would have low glycemic index, and once it is very ripe, it is full of sugar and is high glycemic index. Now that we understand briefly what glycemic index means, we need to know another thing, which is glycemic load. This is another type of number that we give to the carbohydrates. Glycemic index is usually easily found on the internet, and it is a specific number given to the carbohydrate telling us how quickly the glucose is going to rise if you have this carbohydrate. While glycemic load is another type of number calculated on the carbohydrate, which tells you how high the glucose would go because it depends on the glucose load in that particular portion. So glycemic index is the rate of rise of glucose, while glycemic load is that how high the glucose would rise. Let's have a look at some examples. You can calculate glycemic load yourself by using this formula, because glycemic index would be easily found on different tables and charts over the internet, and if you weigh your food, then this formula will help you calculate the glycemic load of that particular food portion. Let's have a look at two fruits here. The banana, which is normally considered as a medium to low glycemic index food, and watermelon, which is a high glycemic index fruit. If we add their glycemic load into the example, this is what you would see. Watermelon, high glycemic index fruit with low glycemic load. It means the portion will have small amount of carbohydrate, which will push the sugars up quickly but not very high. Let's see, in 15 minutes it goes to this level. If you have a very ripe banana with high glycemic index and high glycemic load, in 15 minutes you will see the rise is almost double in the blood glucose as compared to the watermelon, but the speed or the rate of rise is almost the same. Let's see a different example. Again, we have watermelon, high glycemic index and low glycemic load. The sugar does rise rapidly in 15 minutes, but not very high. While a raw or semi-ripe banana, which has low glycemic index but high glycemic load, will slowly bring the sugar up. So it is important to know about both glycemic index and glycemic load of carbohydrates. The worst ones are those which have high glycemic index and high glycemic load, like full sugar Coke. These carbohydrates are only used as a rapid source of energy when you're having a hypoglycemic episode. That is, your sugars are dropping down rapidly and you need a rapid source of energy. It's useful to know which carbohydrates would have high glycemic load or low glycemic load. Watermelon, peanuts, beans, brown flakes, they're all low glycemic loads. Brown rice, banana could be medium glycemic loads. Similarly, corn flakes, if you're having cereals in your breakfast, they're high glycemic load. Full sugar Coke and the raisins are also high glycemic loads. They can be used for correction of hypoglycemia. Another concept is a plate. You can divide it into 4 portions. Half of it should be filled with vegetables. 1/4 is protein and 1/4 is carbs, and that should be starchy carbs. It means that if you stick to low glycemic index and low glycemic load carbohydrates, you have a look at the labels about the type of carbs, the quantity of carbs. You weigh your foods. This is all hard work, but you can keep your sugars in a very reasonable target range. Do not forget, you still need to carry on taking your medications, whether it is insulin or tablets, but your sugar would be less problematic. I hope you found these tips useful, and hopefully your blood sugar remains in good target range.